The desert of Karbala groaned under the weight of destiny. Winds whispered through the dry sand like ancient voices mourning what had not yet occurred. The sun burned down upon the land, casting long shadows beside the tents of the camp of truth. Here, under the gaze of heaven, walked a man once forgotten by society, once owned, once invisible to the world, now among the most honored souls to ever walk the earth. His name was John ibn Huwai. He had once been a slave, born into a life of servitude, traded as property, silenced by the chains of status. But fate had led him to the house of Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, one of the earliest and most sincere followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Abu Dhar had treated him with kindness and, more importantly, had introduced him to a family that would reshape the very essence of his being, the family of Imam Ali. From Abu Dhar, he had come into the household of Ali, and there John saw, with his own eyes, what Islam looked like when lived with purity. There was no arrogance in Ali's home. No eyes looked down on him. No hand struck him. In the shadow of Ali, John discovered something he had never tasted before, dignity. And then came the son of Ali, the embodiment of prophetic light, Imam Hussain. John became part of his journey, not just through circumstance, but by choice. The world offered him the freedom to leave, but he remained, bound not by chains, but by love. Now, in the plain of Karbala, the night before Ashura wrapped the camp in a heavy silence. The stars looked on, quiet witnesses to a tragedy the skies themselves would weep for. John sat alone by a small fire, staring into the flickering flame. His fingers ran gently along the edge of his sword, not in fear, but in reflection. The silence was broken by soft footsteps. Imam Hussain approached, his face calm yet carrying the weight of a mountain. He sat beside John and for a while said nothing, just sat as if allowing the moment to breathe. "John," he finally said, his voice low, "you are free. You have always been loyal. You are not bound to what awaits tomorrow." John didn't speak immediately. He looked at the fire, as if seeking words in its glow. Then, slowly, he turned to his master. "My lord," he said, "do you think I followed you because I was bound to? I followed you because truth walks where you walk. My color is dark, my lineage humble, but my soul longs to be with you. Let my blood mix with yours on this land, so your grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, may recognize me among your companions." Imam Hussain didn't respond with words. His eyes, filled with tears, said more than language ever could. He placed a hand gently on John's shoulder and nodded. There was no need to speak further. In that moment, brotherhood was sealed not by name or race or status, but by sincerity. As the Imam walked away into the night, John turned his gaze upward. The stars above twinkled with a sorrowful light, and he whispered under his breath, "O Allah, make me worthy of him." The night passed with the wind brushing through the tents like a ghost. In one tent, small children sobbed in their mothers' laps. In another, warriors sharpened swords with hands steady, yet hearts trembling. Zainab's voice could be heard reciting Quran softly. The camp was preparing not for survival, but for sacrifice. Morning arrived like a verdict. The sun rose, without mercy, casting its harsh light on the thousands that had come to crush a handful of souls. Dust rose with every hoof-beat as Ammar ibn Sa'd's army lined the battlefield. Their weapons gleamed in the sun, but their hearts were rusted with greed and fear. Within the camp of Imam Hussain, calm prevailed. The companions, one by one, began stepping forward, offering their lives for the truth. They did not seek victory through numbers, but through loyalty. Each one who rode into the battlefield did so knowing they would not return. John stood in the shadows of the camp, watching as friend after friend fell, their bodies returning to the soil of Karbala like raindrops in a dry land. Habib ibn Mazahir, Muslim ibn Osaya, men of valor now resting in dust. And then John stepped forward. His hands tightened around the hilt of his sword. His heart did not hesitate. He approached Imam Hussain, who stood beside a dying companion. Blood stained the ground and grief lined his face. When he saw John, he knew what he had come for. "Allow me to go," John said. Imam Hussain looked at him, his eyes soft. "John, you have done enough. You are not of the Ahlul Bayt. You are a guest and a free man." John raised his voice, not in anger, but in pain. "Do you deny me the honor of fighting for you because of my skin, because of my birth? I have served you in peace. Will you not allow me to serve you in war?" Imam Hussein's lips trembled. He took John's face in his hands and kissed his forehead. "Go, John," he said, voice cracking, "and may Allah reward you with the company of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him." With that, John mounted his horse. He wore no armor of gold or jewels, just a simple shield, a sharpened blade, and the conviction of one who had found his purpose. As he rode into the field, cries rose from the enemy ranks. "Who is this?" someone scoffed. "A slave dares to fight us?" John raised his voice, a cry that pierced through the desert. "I am John, the servant of Hussein. I strike you not with hatred, but with love, for I love a man you have dared to betray." He fought with courage that shamed seasoned warriors. His blade moved like wind through wheat. He struck down those who mocked him, silenced those who questioned his worth. Blood sprayed from the enemy as the former slave became a lion. He took wounds, many of them. An arrow pierced his side. A spear struck his leg. Still he stood, still he fought, until at last, surrounded and wounded, he fell from his horse. As his body hit the dust, he whispered words that only the sky heard. "My God, I am coming." Imam Hussain rushed to the battlefield, falling to his knees beside John's broken form. He lifted his head, placed it on his lap, and wept. John opened his eyes weakly. His lips moved. "Did I do well, my master?" Tears streamed down the Imam's face. "You did more than well," he whispered. "You shone today like the brightest star in the sky." A smile touched John's lips. His eyes closed, and his soul departed free. At last, the lap of the Imam was still beneath John's head, though his soul had already ascended. The ground of Karbala, dry and heartless, now bore the blood of a man whose skin was dark, but whose spirit outshone the sun. Imam Hussain lingered for a moment longer, his tears soaking into the dust, as if to preserve the sacrifice offered by the man once called a slave, but who had died more honored than kings. Around him, the battlefield howled. Arrows flew like flocks of crows, screeching through the air. The enemy beat their drums louder, trying to silence the grief they could never understand. And yet, for Imam Hussain, time had stilled in that moment. He had just buried another piece of his heart, and though his body returned to the camp, his soul felt a little heavier, a little lonelier. When he stood again, his cloak now stained with John's blood, the companions watched him in silent reverence. His face bore the pain of 100 deaths, yet his eyes were calm, as if he carried within him the knowledge of a promise greater than this world. He did not call for another fighter. He didn't have to. One by one, they came forward, offering their lives. But in the heart of the camp, the women wept softly. Some tears were for their own brothers, sons, and husbands. But many were for John, for a man who had been born into chains, walked through the fire of prejudice, and finally reached the highest station of honor through love. Sayyidah Zainab stood by her tent, her gaze fixed toward the battlefield. She had known John since the days of her father, Imam Ali. She had seen him carry water, clean swords, and protect the family like a silent guardian. Never had he spoken above his station, yet he had always walked with pride, not the pride of arrogance, but of faith. Her whisper broke the wind. "Ya Allah, count him among the best of our companions." Meanwhile, in the enemy camp, confusion was spreading. The soldiers who watched John fight had seen something they didn't expect: strength, courage, and grace, in a man they had mocked. A commander cursed under his breath. "If even their freed slaves fight like lions," he spat, "what of their sons?" He didn't know that for Imam Hussain there was no such thing as a freed slave or a noble bloodline. There were only those who stood for truth, and those who betrayed it. Back in the camp of the Imam, the number of companions had dwindled. Each martyr took a piece of the day with him, and now the afternoon sun stood like a judge above the land. The cries of children in the tents behind him were growing softer, not because they had stopped crying, but because they were growing weaker. The thirst had set in like a second sword, cutting into their innocence. Imam Hussain stood outside the tents, wiping the blood from his sword. His clothes were torn. His eyes were sunken. The weight of loss pulled at his shoulders. He looked toward the battlefield, toward the spot where John had fallen, and then lifted his hands in prayer. "O Allah, accept from me this sacrifice." Suddenly, a voice came from behind. It was a child's voice, soft, shaking. "Uncle." He turned. It was Qasim ibn Hazan, the son of his beloved brother. His face was young, untouched by age, but his eyes bore the fire of legacy. Behind him stood Ali Akbar, his own son, and Abbas, the moon of the Banu Hashim. They had all heard the last breath of John, and in it they had found strength. The boy Qasim approached, holding a sword too large for his small frame. "Give me permission, uncle," he said, "to do what John has done." Imam Hussein's heart clenched. He looked at the child and saw not a warrior, but the shadow of his brother. Could he send him to die? Could he let go of this last remnant of Hazan? He took Qasim's hand and led him away from the others. In the privacy of the shadows between tents, he knelt beside him. "Qasim, how do you see death?" he asked softly. Qasim's reply came without hesitation. "Sweeter than honey, if it is with you." Imam Hussain could no longer hold back his tears. He pressed his forehead to the boy's and wept. John's death had been an earthquake, not because he was a great general, not because he commanded armies, but because he had proven that faith erased all barriers, that love, when rooted in truth, made the weakest among men stronger than 1,000. Back on the battlefield, John's body still lay, covered in dust, surrounded by enemy soldiers who now kept their distance, not out of respect but fear. They didn't understand how a man who once cleaned others' homes could fight like he had angels in his veins. One of them, a soldier named Harith, finally walked near. He stared at the still corpse. "They say he was a slave," Harith muttered, "but he died like a king." No one responded. Silence hung heavy. Elsewhere, Imam Hussein's thoughts remained with John. He could still hear his final words, could still feel the weight of his head in his lap, could still see the blood, not as something tragic, but sacred dot as the afternoon deepened. A sudden gust of wind swept through the battlefield, lifting a veil of dust. Some believed the desert itself was crying. Others believed the angels had descended to welcome the souls of the martyrs inside the tent. Imam Sajjad, weakened by illness, whispered to his Aunt Zainab, "Aunt, I saw a dream last night. John was walking in a garden, his skin glowing like light, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, stood with open arms, waiting for him." Zainab's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She only nodded. "That is because John died as one of us." The Imam's camp was nearly empty now. Only a few remained. Abbas, the flag-bearer, Ali Akbar, the flower of youth, and Hussein himself, the lion who would not bow. But before any of them would go, Hussein ordered one final act. He returned to where John lay. Gently he brushed the sand from his face, and with his own hands covered his body. There was no shroud, no grave, just love and the dust of Karbala. He looked at the enemy ranks. "You who mock my companions, look upon this man. Look well. You saw him as a slave, but in the eyes of Allah, he is free. Free from your world, free from your chains, free forever." None dared respond. John ibn Huwai, the man who had once been invisible in the streets of Medina, now stood immortal in the pages of Karbala. His story did not end with his death. It had only begun, because in every age, whenever a man is judged by his skin or lineage, the story of John returns, shining, roaring, unyielding dot, and on that day, the desert remembered dust still clung to. The fallen as the day of Ashura moved toward its cruelest hour. The sun, now leaning westward, cast longer shadows over Karbala, and in those shadows lay the body of John ibn Huwai, still, silent, and yet somehow still speaking. His blood had dried into the soil, but his legacy refused to disappear. It clung to the wind. It breathed through the weeping of the tents. It echoed in the footsteps of those who had yet to fall. Imam Hussain stood a short distance from where John lay. He had returned to the battlefield again and again, not to claim vengeance, but to retrieve the broken bodies of his beloved companions. Each body he lifted with his own hands. Each death carved another wound into his heart. But when he came back for John, something lingered in his eyes, something the others had seen but not fully grasped. Perhaps it was the knowledge that John had died not merely in defense of the Imam, but in complete defiance of every societal chain that had once bound him. Perhaps it was the way John had fought, not to prove his worth, but to fulfill his love. Or maybe it was simply that John had lived as a forgotten man and died as a timeless symbol. Now, only a handful of warriors remained. The air inside the camp had changed. Where once there had been the murmur of whispers and the shuffling of sandals on sand, now there was stillness, the silence of absence. Abbas had not yet fallen, nor had Ali Akbar, but everyone knew their time was close. Death had come knocking at every tent, and yet not one heart turned away. Imam Hussain paused at the center of the camp, looking toward the river, then toward the army that waited like wolves. His voice was hoarse but strong. "Is there anyone left to help us?" The call rang out not because he expected help, but because it was a witness, a declaration, a challenge to every soul who heard it. Behind him, a cry answered, not from the army, but from within. It was a child's sob, in the tent. A young boy, no more than 6, clutched his chest. "I would help you, uncle," he cried, "if I had the strength." The boy's name was Abdallah. He was too young to walk the battlefield, too young to wield a sword, and yet his heart had already been shaped by the tragedy he was born into. Hussain entered the tent, knelt before him, and kissed his forehead. "You have helped me," he whispered. "Your love is enough." Moments later, Abbas would walk toward the river. Moments later, Ali Akbar would ride out, and the sound of his fall would shake the skies. But before those moments came, Hussain would once again glance toward the place where John's body lay, and something in him would settle like a knot finally loosening in the soul. As the sun dipped lower, the bodies of the martyrs began to vanish into the red-tinted sands. Abbas, the moon of the Hashemites, now lay beside the river, his arms severed, his mission incomplete, but his sacrifice absolute. Ali Akbar, the flower of the Prophet's household, lay pierced through the chest, his final gaze still fixed on his father, and yet the Imam stood alone. The wind had grown cruel, hot and sharp, carrying with it the cries of women and children who now watched from behind the veils of the tents. They had seen every beloved face taken. Every man who had once stood beside Hussain was now a memory, but John remained more than memory. He had become a mirror. Even the enemy, now stunned by what they had witnessed, grew uneasy. How could so few fight with such peace? How could a man like John, a former slave, fight with more courage than their finest soldiers? Their commander frowned as he watched the battlefield littered with bodies of Hussein's followers. Who were these people? He asked bitterly. A soldier beside him answered without looking. They were believers. Now Hussain stood at the edge of the battlefield, his horse beneath him, his sword heavy in his hand, not from weight, but from grief. He looked upon the rows of enemies, thousands of them. He, one man, yet his back was not bent. His eyes did not waver. In the quiet before his final ride, he raised his hands to the heavens. "O Allah, bear witness. I have given everything, my companions, my sons, my brothers, even the servant who once stood in the back of the crowd. They have all gone before me, and I go to meet you now." He rode. The final storm of Karbala began. Like a lion cornered by 1,000 spears, Hussain fought with the fury of truth. Not for land, not for power, but to awaken the sleeping hearts of history. Each strike was a sermon, each cry a call. But he was only one man, and they were thousands. When he fell, the skies wept. The angels turned their faces, and the ground of Karbala, once barren, now bloomed with the blood of sacrifice. The enemy rushed forward. Arrows rained. Swords clashed. And finally, Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lay still. The tents erupted in wails. Sayyida Zainab stood at the front, her eyes toward the battlefield. Her brother had fallen, but the message had risen. In the aftermath, the enemy looted the tents. They snatched veils, burned fabric, and struck the weak. The women and children were taken captive, paraded through the streets from Karbala to Kufa, and then to Damascus. But the message of Hussain and of every martyr, from Ali Akbar to Abbas, from Muslim ibn Asaya to Habib ibn Mazahir, remained alive. And among those names, remembered with honor, was John ibn Huwai, not as a servant, not as a freed slave, but as a lion. Zainab in Yazid's court would later recount the names of the martyrs. When she mentioned John, she said nothing of his skin or his status. She said only that he stood where the faithful stood, and fell where the brave fell. Imam Sajjad, long after returning to Medina, would visit the grave of his father's companions. When he stood before the scattered graves at Karbala, he stopped at one, knelt, and placed his hand on the dust. He whispered, "O John, you died as one of us, and in heaven you live as one of the greatest among us." The people around him asked, wasn't he a servant? The Imam looked up and with eyes full of truth said, he was a servant, yes, a servant of Allah, and what greater title can there be? Years passed. The dust of Karbala covered many things, but not the memory of that day, not the loyalty of a man who could have left, but stayed, not the sword of a warrior whose battle was not against men, but against silence, racism, and invisibility. Every year, in Majlis across the world, the name of John is recited, and every tear shed for him carries the fragrance of loyalty. When children ask, who was John? They are told not about chains or his past, but about his heart, and in that, his story becomes the story of every soul seeking to belong. John ibn Huwai was not born into greatness. He was born into obscurity, into the darkness of servitude, of prejudice, of namelessness. But through his love for the family of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he rose, not through rebellion, not through war, but through unwavering loyalty to the truth. Karbala gave him what no empire ever could, immortality. In every age, there will be those who feel forgotten, pushed aside, labeled by their skin, their background, or their name. To them, John's story whispers, you matter. Stand with the truth, and you will never be forgotten. Because in the land where kings fell to greed, a servant rose to sainthood. He was the slave who stood like a lion. He was John ibn Huwai,